She was hired to clean his house. She never expected he'd try to clean out her heart. Valentina needed the job to survive. Rafael needed no one, or so he believed. But behind those cold mansion walls, a single glance would ignite something neither of them could control. What happens when the coldest man in the city meets the one woman who refuses to be invisible? Everything is about to change. Before we begin, I need to tell you something. I created Allure TV especially for those of you who follow me here, and there's content on there that this platform would never allow. Uncensored stories, with no cuts and no ads. You'll find everything: steamy stories, mafia stories, billionaire romances, and many more genres that you're going to love. There's new content every day for you to listen to in multiple languages or read whenever you prefer. This channel no longer generates any revenue for me, but I have an amazing team that works hard every week for all of you. The people who join Allure TV are the ones who keep all of this alive, and they get a lot in return. The link is pinned in the comments, or you can simply point your camera at the QR code on the screen. May God bless each and every one of you, wishing you many blessings in your lives. The city glittered beneath a sky bruised with the last light of evening, and the Montenegro estate rose above it all, like something carved from money and silence. Valentina stood at the service entrance, her knuckles white around the strap of her bag, staring up at the glass and stone tower that seemed to swallow the clouds. She smoothed the front of her crisp black uniform, took a breath that tasted like exhaust fumes and ambition, and told herself this was just a job, nothing more. She needed it to be just a job. 6 months of scraping by, 3 interviews that led nowhere, and finally this, a position cleaning one of the most exclusive penthouses in the city, owned by a man everyone talked about but few had actually seen. Rafael Montenegro. The name alone made the other housekeepers lower their voices, as if saying it too loudly might summon something dangerous. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Valentina stepped into a hallway that smelled faintly of cedar and rain-cooled stone. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one side. The city sprawled out beneath them like a field of scattered light. She had never seen anything like it, and for a moment she forgot to walk, forgot to breathe, forgot everything except the quiet, staggering wealth pressing in from every angle. "You're new." The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, and Valentina spun so fast her ponytail whipped against her cheek. He stood there in the doorway of what she assumed was his office, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been poured onto his body, sleeves rolled to the forearm, tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd already fought and won a long day. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and entirely too focused on her. "Yes, sir." "Valentina Reyes. I was told to report to the housekeeping supervisor. She's not here yet." He stepped closer and the scent of him reached her first, cedarwood, and something sharper underneath, like the air right before a storm breaks. "You're early." "I like being early." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Her pulse hammered against her throat as his gaze moved over her, not unkindly, but with an intensity that made her feel entirely too seen. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like a ghost of one he'd decided not to let live. "Do you always talk back to your employer's clients before you've even started the job? Are you a client, or are you the man who owns the building?" The words left her before she could stop them, and she watched his eyebrows lift, surprise flashing across features that had clearly been arranged into practiced indifference for years. "Careful," he said, but there was no heat in it. If anything, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, like she'd cracked something open without meaning to. "People don't usually push back." "I'm not people. I'm the new housekeeper." She lifted her chin, refusing to let the tremor in her stomach show on her face. "Is there a problem with that, Mr. Montenegro?" He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the seconds stretch thin, long enough that the hallway seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the city fading into something distant. His eyes dropped briefly to her mouth, then came back up so fast she almost thought she'd imagined it. "No problem at all," he said finally, and there was something different in his tone now, something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. "Welcome to the house, Valentina." He said her name like he was testing the shape of it, like it was a word he intended to remember. Then, without waiting for a response, He turned and walked back toward his office, leaving her standing in the hallway with her heart doing something it had no business doing over a man she'd known for exactly 90 seconds. She didn't move until the door clicked shut behind him. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding, pressing a hand flat against her sternum, as if she could physically slow the rhythm underneath. Get it together, Valentina. This was a job. He was her employer, whatever that had been. The charged silence, the too long look, the way her skin had prickled under his attention, it meant nothing. It couldn't mean anything. She caught her reflection in the polished elevator doors, barely recognizing the flush still lingering on her cheekbones. This wasn't like her. She didn't unravel over a stranger's voice, over a stare that lasted seconds too long. She had bills to pay, a mother who depended on this job and no room in her life for whatever that had been. And yet her hand trembled as she reached for the cart of supplies waiting at the end of the hall, as if her body had already decided something her mind refused to admit. The supervisor arrived minutes later, brisk and businesslike, rattling off schedules and expectations, showing her the service corridors that ran like hidden veins behind the marble and glass of the main house. Valentina nodded along, absorbing everything, grateful for the distraction. But even as she memorized which cleaning supplies belonged in which closet, some traitorous part of her mind kept circling back to dark eyes and a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. Later, mopping the west wing in the hush of an empty house, she caught her own reflection in one of the darkened windows, and for just a second she swore she saw movement behind her, a shape pausing in a doorway down the hall before disappearing just as quickly. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination after a long, strange first day. But she didn't quite believe it. And somewhere on the floor above, behind a closed office door, Rafael Montenegro stood very still, staring at nothing, wondering why he couldn't stop thinking about a girl with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had looked at him like he was just a man, and not the empire he'd spent his whole life building around himself. Rafael Montenegro did not make a habit of watching his employees. That was the point of hiring people, so he never had to think about them again, so his days could run on schedules and signatures instead of faces he had to remember. And yet, 3 days into Valentina's employment, he found himself standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his home office, coffee cooling untouched in his hand, watching her move through the garden terrace below, with a kind of attention he couldn't quite justify. She worked differently than the others, not faster, not slower, just present somehow in a way that unsettled him. She paused to notice things. The way morning light hit the fountain, the particular angle at which she straightened a crooked photo frame, as if the imbalance physically bothered her. She hummed sometimes, low and almost inaudible, some song he didn't recognize, and stopped abruptly whenever she thought someone might hear. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. A man surrounded by people who performed deference for a paycheck didn't often encounter someone who simply existed in his space without trying to impress him. "You're staring, sir." Rafael turned so fast he nearly spilled the coffee. Valentina stood in the doorway of his office, a stack of folded linens in her arms, her expression carefully neutral except for the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, the kind of almost smile that dared him to deny it. "I was looking at the fountain," he said, the lie leaving his mouth with practiced ease. "The fountain's on the other side of the terrace." She set the linens down on the console table by the door, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world and knew exactly how uncomfortable that made him. But sure, the fountain. Something in his chest tightened, not annoyance, though he tried to file it under that heading. It felt closer to being caught doing something human. He wasn't used to that particular sensation, and he didn't care for it. "Do you always speak to your employer this way?" "You already asked me that on my first day." She met his eyes without flinching, without the careful deference he was used to from people who worked in this house. "The answer's still the same. I speak the way I speak. If that's a problem, I understand there's a whole waiting list of housekeepers who'd rather stay quiet." He almost laughed. He caught it before it escaped, swallowing it down like it was something dangerous, something that might reveal too much if let loose in the open air between them. Instead, he crossed his arms, studying her the way he studied a difficult negotiation, searching for the angle, the weakness, the thing that would make sense of why she affected him at all. "I don't want you quiet," he said, and immediately regretted how honest it sounded. Valentina's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. "That's the closest thing to a compliment I've gotten from you. Don't get used to it. Wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Montenegro." But there was warmth threaded through the formality now, something that hadn't been there in their first exchange, a familiarity neither of them had earned yet, but that existed anyway, stubborn and undeniable. She turned to leave, and for one absurd second he wanted to stop her. Wanted an excuse to keep the conversation alive a moment longer, wanted to know what she'd say next, what unpredictable thing might come out of her mouth. He didn't understand the impulse. He rarely wanted anything from the people in this house beyond competence and silence, beyond the quiet efficiency that let him forget they existed at all once their tasks were done. But there was nothing forgettable about her, and that alone made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite name. Valentina. She paused at the door, glancing back at him, dark hair catching the afternoon light spilling in from the windows. "Yes?" He searched for something to say, something that wouldn't sound like what it actually was. "The East Wing needs attention before the weekend. There's an event." It wasn't what he'd meant to say. It wasn't even necessary. The schedule already covered it, and she knew that as well as he did, judging by the way her expression shifted, amusement flickering behind her eyes like she'd caught him in something. "Understood, sir." She held his gaze a beat longer than professional courtesy required, long enough that the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of them named. Then she was gone, footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and the echo of a conversation that had somehow meant more than its words. Rafael stood alone in his office, coffee forgotten entirely now, staring at the doorway where she'd been. He thought of his father, of the lessons drilled into him since childhood. Trust no one, need no one, let no one close enough to matter, because the ones who got close were always the ones who eventually left the deepest wounds. Those rules had kept him safe for 34 years. They had also kept him utterly alone, a fact he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. He didn't know what it was about her, the sharp tongue, the steady eyes, the refusal to shrink under the weight of his money and his name. Whatever it was, it had slipped past every defense he'd spent a lifetime building, quiet and unannounced, like water finding a crack in stone. That night, long after the house had gone dark and silent, he found himself walking past the service corridor where her small quarters were located, telling himself he was simply checking the property, simply making his rounds like any responsible owner would. He didn't stop. He didn't knock. But he noticed the thin line of light still glowing beneath her door, and something in him, something he refused to name, something that felt dangerously close to longing, wanted, quietly and fiercely, to know what kept her awake. What thoughts moved behind those steady eyes when no one was watching her back? By the end of the first week, the household staff had started noticing things, small things, the kind of things that meant nothing on their own but added up to something impossible to ignore. Rafael Montenegro, who once walked past his employees like they were furniture, now lingered in doorways. He asked questions he didn't need answers to. He found reasons, always reasonable, always plausible, to be in whatever room Valentina happened to be cleaning. "He's never in the East Wing this early," murmured Carmen, the housekeeper who'd worked for the family longer than anyone could remember, watching Rafael disappear down the hallway with his tablet under his arm and absolutely no discernible purpose. "Never." Valentina pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the bookshelf she was dusting, though her pulse had already picked up its now familiar rhythm the moment she'd caught his cologne drifting through the open door. "Miss Reyes." His voice, when it came, held that particular note of forced formality she'd learned to recognize, the tone he used when he wanted to sound like he had a reason for being somewhere. "Mr. Montenegro." She didn't turn around immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be its own kind of statement. When she finally did face him, she caught the flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't rushed to attention the way most people did. "You missed a shelf." He nodded toward the far corner of the bookcase, though his eyes weren't actually on the shelf at all. "Did I?" She walked toward it slowly, deliberately unhurried, and ran a finger along the wood. Not a speck of dust. Funny? Looks clean to me. Maybe you need glasses. Maybe you need a better excuse to walk this way 3 times in one morning. The words left her before she'd fully decided to say them, and she watched something shift across his face. Not quite shock, but close to it, like she'd reached into his carefully constructed composure and pulled a thread loose. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The late morning light slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes suspended in the air between them, and Raphael's jaw tightened in a way that told her she'd landed somewhere true. "I have every reason to be in my own house," he said finally, but there was no real conviction behind it. "Of course you do." She turned back to the shelf, hiding the smile threatening to break loose at the corners of her mouth. "I'm sure the East Wing just happens to need your personal attention every single day. Are you always this insufferable? Only with people who deserve it." She glanced back at him over her shoulder, and something electric passed between them. Quick, charged, gone almost before it registered. His mouth twitched, the closest thing to an actual smile she'd seen from him yet, before he caught himself and smoothed his expression back into something more appropriately distant. "I have a call in 10 minutes, he said, which was almost certainly true, and almost certainly not the reason he'd been standing there for the last 5. "Then you should probably go take it." She kept her tone light, teasing, refusing to let him see how much his presence had rattled the careful rhythm of her morning. "Unless the East Wing has more urgent business." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day in the hallway, like he was trying to solve something he didn't have the right equations for. Then, without another word, he turned and left, and Valentina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She caught Carmen watching from the doorway, eyebrows raised in silent, knowing amusement. "What?" Valentina asked, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite her best efforts. "Nothing." Carmen's smile was entirely too satisfied. "It's just been a long time since I've seen him talk to anyone like that. Usually he just gives instructions and walks away. We were arguing about a bookshelf." Carmen didn't look convinced, and honestly neither was Valentina. There had been nothing about that exchange that felt like an argument about dust or shelving. It had felt like something else entirely. A current running beneath the surface of ordinary words, both of them speaking in code neither wanted to admit they understood. That evening, alone in her small room off the service corridor, Valentina caught herself smiling at nothing in particular, replaying the exchange in her mind with an embarrassing amount of detail. The way his jaw had tightened, the almost smile he'd swallowed before it could fully form, the ridiculous, thrilling audacity of teasing a man who owned half the buildings in the financial district. She told herself it meant nothing. He was infuriating, arrogant, entirely too used to getting his way. And yet she found herself looking forward to the next time their paths would cross, already composing sharper responses for whatever excuse he'd invent next. 2 floors above, in the quiet of his study, Raphael sat with his laptop open and unread, staring at nothing, thinking about a woman who dusted shelves that were already clean and dared to call him insufferable to his face. No one spoke to him that way. No one had in years. He should have been irritated. He should have reminded her politely but firmly of the professional boundaries that existed between an employer and his staff. Instead, he found himself already thinking of a reason to walk past the East Wing again tomorrow. He poured himself a drink, swirling it absently as the city lights blinked on beyond his window, and allowed himself for one indulgent moment to wonder what it would feel like to hear her laugh. Really laugh, not the restrained, almost smile she gave him, but something unguarded and full. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because wanting something like that meant wanting her, and wanting anyone was a door he'd sealed shut a long time ago, for reasons he had no intention of explaining to anyone, least of all to the woman currently rearranging every certainty he'd built his life around. The storm arrived without warning, a wall of black clouds swallowing the skyline within the hour, turning the city's glittering lights into smeared, distant smudges behind sheets of rain. Valentina had just finished folding the last of the linens in the East Wing when the first crack of thunder rattled the windows hard enough to make her jump. The lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging the penthouse into a darkness so total it took her a moment to remember how to breathe. Valentina. Rafael's voice carried down the hallway sharper than usual, edged with something that might have been concern. She heard his footsteps before she saw the beam of his phone flashlight cutting through the black. "I'm here." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the storm. "The generator should kick in soon, right?" "It should." He appeared at the end of the hallway, illuminated in the harsh white glow of his phone. Hair slightly disheveled, tie already discarded somewhere earlier in the evening. "But the backup system's been acting up. I've had someone scheduled to fix it for 2 weeks, so we're stuck in the dark. Looks that way." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely unhappy about it, though he'd never admit it aloud. "There are candles in the study. Come on." They moved through the penthouse together, his phone light guiding them past shadowed furniture and rain-streaked windows, until they reached the study where he produced a box of pillar candles and lit them one by one, the flames throwing warm light across walls she'd never seen without the sterile glow of overhead lighting. The effect was startling. The cold, curated perfection of the house softened into something almost intimate, shadows dancing along the bookshelves, the storm hammering against the windows like it wanted in. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the leather armchair across from his desk, and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if she wanted one. She took it anyway, settling into the chair as thunder rolled through the sky, close enough now to rattle the glass in the window panes. "This is surreal," she admitted, wrapping both hands around the glass, letting its warmth seep into fingers gone cold from the sudden chill of the powerless house. "A month ago, I was scrubbing bathrooms for extra cash. Now I'm drinking wine with Rafael Montenegro during a blackout. Life takes strange turns." He settled into the chair across from her, candlelight catching the sharp angles of his face, softening them into something almost unguarded. "Mine certainly has." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly, watching the wine catch the candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual polish, gone rougher, more honest. "My father built this empire believing trust is a liability. He taught me that before I could walk, practically. Every relationship is a transaction. Every kindness is a debt someone will eventually collect." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the small space between them, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I haven't told anyone that. Not like this." "Why me?" "I don't know." He said it like a confession, like the admission cost him something. "Maybe because you don't want anything from me. Everyone else in my life wants something. Money, connections, my name attached to their projects. You just argue with me about bookshelves." She laughed softly, surprised by how easily it came, how the sound seemed to loosen something in his shoulders. "Someone has to keep you honest." Apparently. His mouth curved, the almost smile finally breaking free into something real, something that transformed his entire face. "What about you? What's your story?" Valentina hesitated, unused to being asked, unused to anyone caring enough to ask. "My mother raised me alone. She worked herself sick trying to make sure I never noticed what we didn't have. I promised myself I'd be different, independent, careful, never depending on anyone who could disappear." Sounds like we both learned the same lesson from different directions. "Trust no one." "Trust no one," he echoed, and something passed between them, recognition, or the particular intimacy of 2 guarded people finding a matching wound. The candles flickered as wind pressed against the windows, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence stretching comfortable and charged all at once. Raphael's eyes moved over her face in the low light, lingering longer than propriety allowed, and she felt heat rise beneath her skin that had nothing to do with the wine. "Valentina." "Yes?" "I don't know what this is." His voice had dropped low, rough at the edges. "Whatever's happening between us. Maybe it doesn't need one yet." He reached across the small distance separating them, and his fingers brushed against hers where they rested on the arm of the chair. Barely a touch, except neither of them pulled away. The contact sent something electric racing up her arm, and she watched his breath catch, watched the careful composure he wore like armor crack open just slightly. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, and the candles guttered in a sudden draught. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them had become its own language, saying everything neither was ready to admit aloud. And as the storm raged on outside, something inside the quiet study shifted permanently, irreversibly, into something neither of them could take back. Somewhere beneath the sound of rain against glass, Valentina realized she had stopped counting the reasons this was a bad idea. His hand rested near hers, close enough she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, and she found herself wondering what it might feel like if he closed that last distance entirely. The thought frightened her more than the storm did. Rafael seemed to be fighting a similar battle, jaw tight, eyes dark in the flickering light, torn between instinct telling him to pull back and the quiet pull keeping him exactly where he was. Neither said what they were thinking. The rain answered for them, steady against the windows, and the storm showed no sign of passing any time soon. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under a pale, watery sun, but something in the penthouse had shifted that hadn't been there before. Valentina noticed it in the careful way Rafael avoided her eyes over breakfast, in the too long pause before he said good morning, like he was recalibrating something between them that neither of them had agreed to name. She found him 3 days later on the private terrace off his study, standing at the railing with his back to the door, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand despite the early morning hour. He hadn't heard her approach, and for a moment she simply watched him, shoulders tense, jaw set, staring out at the skyline like it owed him an answer he hadn't gotten yet. "You're not usually up here this time of day," she said quietly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and something in his expression made her chest tighten, a rawness she hadn't seen before, like whatever careful mask he usually wore had slipped without his permission. "Today's my father's birthday." "Oh." She stepped closer, unsure of the boundaries between them now, unsure what version of Rafael she was standing in front of. "Were you close?" "Once." He looked back out at the city, his knuckles whitening slightly around the glass. "He died 4 years ago. Before that we didn't speak for almost a decade. What happened?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed somewhere he wasn't willing to go, but then he exhaled, slow and deliberate, and began to speak in a voice stripped of its usual armor. "My mother left when I was 19. Took everything she could carry and half the company's key investors with her. Turned out she'd been building an exit strategy for years, feeding information to a rival firm my father had spent his whole life competing against." His jaw tightened. "My father blamed me. Said I should have noticed, should have warned him, as if a teenager should have been running counterintelligence on his own mother. That's not fair. Fair didn't matter to him. Results mattered. Loyalty mattered above everything else, and in his eyes I'd failed at both." He finally turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression struck her somewhere deep and unguarded. "He spent the rest of his life testing me, watching for it, trying to see if I'd betray him too, the way she had. Every decision I made, every relationship, every friend, he assumed there was an angle, a betrayal waiting to happen. And you believed him. I became him." The admission seemed to cost him something physical, his shoulders dropping slightly, like he'd been carrying the weight of those words for years and had finally set them down. "I stopped letting anyone close enough to hurt me. Business partners, women I dated, even old friends from university. I kept everyone at exactly the right distance, close enough to be useful, far enough to never matter." Valentina moved closer without quite deciding to, until she stood beside him at the railing, the city spread out beneath them in the morning light. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded passing between them. "I didn't realize how lonely until you started arguing with me about bookshelves." She laughed softly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "I have that effect on people. You have that effect on me." His voice had dropped, rough and quiet, and the space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. "I don't know what to do with that. I've spent 15 years building walls, and you've been here a month." Maybe walls aren't as sturdy as you thought. Maybe. His hand moved almost involuntarily, brushing against hers where it rested on the railing. The contact sent warmth racing up her arm, and she watched his breath catch, watched him war with himself over whether to pull away or lean further in. Neither of them moved. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, quieter now, more honest than she'd ever heard him. "I don't know how to let someone matter without waiting for the moment they leave. Nobody knows how to do that." She turned her hand slightly beneath his, until their fingers laced together properly, no longer accidental, no longer deniable. "You just do it anyway. That's the whole terrifying, ridiculous point." His eyes dropped to their joined hands, then back up to her face, something shifting in his expression. Fear, maybe, or its exact opposite. "My father would say you're exactly the kind of risk he warned me about. Your father isn't here." "No." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, fragile and unfamiliar on his face. "He isn't." They stood there together as the city woke fully beneath them, traffic humming, the sun climbing higher, neither willing to be the one who let go first. Valentina could feel her own carefully built walls trembling too, every instinct that told her this was reckless, unwise, a collision waiting to happen between two people from entirely different worlds. But his hand was warm around hers, and his eyes held something she hadn't expected to find in a man everyone described as cold, a wound so deep it had calcified into distance, waiting, apparently, for someone stubborn enough to reach past it. "Rafael." Her voice came out softer than she intended. Yes." She didn't answer right away, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name, aware of how close they were standing, how easily this could tip into something neither of them could take back. Whatever she'd been about to say dissolved entirely as his gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there a beat too long, the air between them growing thick and charged and impossible to ignore. Somewhere below, the city carried on, indifferent to the two people standing frozen at the edge of something neither had a name for yet, both of them terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, neither willing to be the one to step back first. Neither of them moved first. That was the strange, suspended truth of it, the way the moment seemed to arrive on its own, independent of decision, as if it had been building for weeks, and simply chose that instant, on the terrace with the city humming awake below them, to finally demand its due. Rafael's hand tightened around hers, and Valentina felt the last of her resistance give way. Some careful wall she'd been maintaining since the day she'd walked through the service entrance, finally crumbling into dust. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to laugh it off, to remind them both of the professional distance they were supposed to maintain. She didn't step back. When his mouth finally found hers, it wasn't tentative at all. It was the kind of kiss that came from weeks of restraint finally breaking, from every charged glance and unspoken word crashing together at once. His free hand came up to cradle her jaw, fingers threading gently into her hair, and Valentina's own hand fisted in the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, as if putting distance between them now was physically impossible. The city noise faded to nothing. The morning light, the traffic below, the entire weight of everything that separated them, his name, his money, the impossible gulf between the man who owned this penthouse and the woman who cleaned it, all of it disappeared, narrowed down to the warmth of his mouth against hers and the steady, thundering rhythm of two hearts that had been fighting this exact outcome for far too long. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing unevenly, foreheads nearly touching, his hand still cupping her face like he wasn't ready to let the moment end. "I've wanted to do that since the very day you called me insufferable," he admitted, voice rough, eyes searching hers with something close to wonder. "I called you insufferable because you were being insufferable." But her voice shook slightly, betraying the composure she was trying to project, and she felt her own smile break free, despite every instinct telling her to stay guarded. "I'm still insufferable." His thumb traced her cheekbone, gentle, almost reverent. "You should probably know that before this goes any further." "I had a feeling." She laughed softly, but the sound caught in her throat as reality began creeping back in, cold and insistent, chipping away at the warmth still humming through her chest. "Rafael, this—" "Don't." He must have heard the shift in her voice, because his expression tightened, bracing for whatever she was about to say. "Don't turn this into something complicated before we've even had a chance to enjoy it." "It is complicated." She stepped back slightly, needing space to think clearly, needing distance from the pull of him that made rational thought nearly impossible. "I work for you. I clean your bathrooms and fold your laundry. What happens when your friends find out? You're bored. The people at whatever gala you're attending next month. I don't care what they think. You will." Her voice softened, not accusatory, just honest, weighted with the kind of clarity that came from growing up watching her mother struggle against a world that never let people like them forget their place. "People like you don't end up with people like me, Rafael, not really. Not in any way that lasts." Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, or frustration at being told the truth he didn't want to hear. "I think this is some kind of temporary distraction, some novelty I'll get bored of. I think the world will tell you that, eventually, even if you don't believe it right now." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning sun. "And I think it'll be easier for both of us if we stop this before it becomes something neither of us can walk away from cleanly." "Maybe I don't want to walk away cleanly." He reached for her hand again and she let him take it, unable to summon the will to refuse, even as every practical instinct screamed at her to protect herself. "Maybe for the first time in longer than I can remember, I want something messy and complicated and entirely inconvenient. That's easy to say now." She met his eyes, searching for the moment this would all fall apart, because surely it would, the way everything good in her life eventually did. "It's harder to mean it when the whole world is telling you it's a mistake." "Then let them talk." His grip on her hand tightened, insistent, grounding. "I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me. The right deals, the right connections, the right kind of distance from everyone who might actually matter. I'm tired of it, Valentina. I'm tired of being exactly who my father built me to be." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. Wanted to lean into the warmth of his hand around hers and forget every practical fear crowding into her mind. But she'd learned long ago that wanting something didn't make it safe, and the space between his world and hers felt in that moment wider than the city spread out beneath them. "Give me time," she said finally, quieter now. "This is a lot, all at once. I need to think. Take whatever time you need." He pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles before releasing her hand, and something about the gesture, restrained, patient, entirely unlike the arrogant man she'd first met, undid her more than the earlier kiss had. "I'm not going anywhere." But as she walked back inside, her heart still racing, her mind already spinning with every reason this could end in disaster, she couldn't shake the growing certainty that whatever fragile thing had just begun between them was already far too fragile to survive the world waiting just beyond the penthouse walls. And somewhere beneath the fear, quieter but no less insistent, was the equally frightening certainty that she didn't want to stop it either, no matter how many reasons her mind kept building against it. The name came up by accident, the way most dangerous things did. In the middle of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, while Valentina was organizing files in the study Rafael had asked her to help tidy before a board meeting. A folder slipped from the shelf, spilling old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings across the floor, and one headline caught her eye before she could stop herself from reading it. "Montenegro ends engagement amid scandal. Sources cite loyalty test gone wrong." She sat back on her heels, staring at the photograph beneath the headline. A much younger Rafael, jaw tighter, eyes colder, standing beside a woman with dark hair and a devastated expression, cameras flashing around them like a swarm. "You shouldn't be looking at that." She hadn't heard him enter. Rafael stood in the doorway, his expression carefully blank in a way she'd learned to recognize as the mask he wore when something actually mattered. It fell out of the folder. She held up the clipping, her voice steadier than she felt. "Who is she?" "Someone from a long time ago." He crossed the room and took the clipping from her hand, folding it away with more care than his casual tone suggested. "It's not relevant." "It says you had her tested." Valentina rose to her feet, unable to shake the unsettled feeling curling through her chest. "What does that mean, Rafael?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him decide, visibly, whether to tell her the truth or retreat behind the careful walls he'd spent years perfecting. Finally he sighed, sitting down heavily in the chair behind his desk. Her name was Isabella. We were engaged for 8 months back when I was 26, and convinced I'd finally found someone who wanted me instead of what I could give her. His voice had gone flat, stripped of the warmth she'd grown used to hearing. My father was still alive then. He didn't trust her. Told me she was after the money, the name, the access, the same way my mother had been. So what did you do? I hired someone. He said it simply, without flinching, though something in his jaw suggested the admission cost him. A private investigator, posing as a wealthy contact interested in a business partnership. I wanted to see if she'd leak information about the company, about our finances, if the right amount of money was dangled in front of her. Valentina felt something cold settle in her stomach. And? She didn't take the bait. Not once. Not even when he offered her more money than she'd see in 10 years. He looked up at her, something bleak passing across his face. But she found out what I'd done, found the investigator's real identity, put the pieces together herself, and she was right to hate me for it. Why didn't you tell her the truth from the start? Why not just trust her? Because I didn't know how. The honesty in his voice was almost worse than if he'd tried to justify it. My father had spent my whole life teaching me that trust was a weakness people exploited. I thought I was protecting myself. I thought I was being careful. He shook his head slowly. I destroyed the one person who actually deserved better than the version of me my father built. Valentina wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the ground shift beneath a relationship she'd only just started to trust. And you're telling me this now because I don't want to become that version of myself again. He stood, crossing the room toward her, but she stepped back before he could close the distance, needing space to think, needing air that didn't smell like his cologne and complicated history. How do I know you haven't done something similar to me? The question left her before she could stop it, sharp and frightened all at once. How do I know this isn't some elaborate test too? Seeing if the housekeeper can be bought, can be trusted, can be broken the way you broke her. Valentina, that's not... Isn't it? Her voice cracked slightly, betraying how deeply the fear had already taken root. You just told me you tested the last woman you loved, investigated her, manipulated her without her knowledge. How am I supposed to trust that you haven't done the exact same thing to me? I would never do that to you. His voice had gone urgent, pleading in a way she'd never heard from him before. What I feel for you isn't some calculation. It isn't a test. You said the same kind of thing about her, probably, before everything fell apart. Valentina felt tears threatening, hot and humiliating, and she blinked hard against them, refusing to let this become something she'd regret later. I need to think. I need space from this, from you, from everything that just happened in the last 10 minutes. Please don't shut me out over something from years ago that has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us. She moved toward the door, every instinct telling her to put distance between herself and the man who suddenly felt like a stranger, wearing a familiar face. You just showed me exactly what you're capable of when trust becomes inconvenient. I'd be a fool not to take that seriously. She left him standing alone in the study, the clipping still clutched in his hand, and as she walked away, she felt the fragile trust they'd built over the past weeks, crumbling faster than she knew how to stop, each step widening a distance that suddenly felt far more permanent than either of them wanted to admit. Behind her she heard nothing, no footsteps following, no voice calling her back, and the silence hurt more than an argument would have. She reached her small room off the service corridor and closed the door, sinking onto the edge of the narrow bed, replaying his words over and over until they blurred into something she could no longer make sense of. Was it fear speaking or wisdom? She honestly didn't know anymore, and that uncertainty frightened her almost as much as the photograph had. 5 long days passed in a silence so thick it seemed to seep into the walls of the penthouse itself. Valentina moved through her duties with mechanical precision, dusting shelves she no longer noticed, folding linens without registering their texture against her fingers. She avoided the East Wing entirely now, rerouting her schedule to minimize any chance of crossing paths with Rafael. though the effort itself felt like its own small betrayal. Proof that whatever they'd built together had already fractured beyond simple repair. She caught glimpses of him sometimes at a distance, standing at his study window with a drink he never seemed to finish, disappearing into his office for hours that stretched well past midnight, the light beneath his door the only sign he hadn't simply vanished entirely into whatever cold, familiar isolation he'd retreated back into. "You look tired," Carmen said one morning, setting a cup of coffee down beside Valentina without being asked. "Both of you do, actually. It's like watching two people mourn something that hasn't even died yet." "Nothing's happening between us, Carmen." The lie came automatically now, worn smooth from repetition. Carmen's expression suggested she believed exactly none of it. "I've worked in this house 11 years. I've never seen him like this, not even after his father passed." Valentina said nothing, focusing instead on the coffee cooling untouched in front of her, unable to explain the tangled knot of fear and longing sitting heavy in her chest. She'd meant to think clearly, to weigh the risks with the careful logic that had guided every major decision in her life. Instead, she found herself replaying his voice, his hands, the particular way he'd looked at her on that terrace, like she was the only steady thing in a world built on calculation and distrust. She was still deciding whether to submit her resignation when she found him in the kitchen late one evening, standing at the counter with his sleeves rolled up, making coffee he clearly didn't need at that hour. "You're still here," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I work here." Her voice came out flatter than she intended. For now, anyway. Something in his expression flickered. Alarm, maybe, quickly suppressed. "You're thinking about leaving." "I'm thinking about a lot of things." She crossed her arms, keeping the counter between them like a barrier neither of them had agreed to, but both seemed to need. This job was supposed to be simple. Clean the house, collect a paycheck, go home. I didn't sign up for whatever this has become. I never meant to hurt you. I know. And she did know, which somehow made it worse, made the whole situation feel less like a clean betrayal, and more like a slow, unavoidable collision between two people who'd never had a real chance to begin with. That's almost the saddest part of all this. You didn't mean to. You just are who you are, and I'm not sure that's something either of us can fix. Rafael set down the mug he'd been holding, untouched coffee forgotten entirely. "Is that what you think? That I'm incapable of change? I think you spent your whole life learning that trust gets people hurt. I don't know how you undo something that deep, no matter how much either of us wants to." She swallowed hard, hating how her voice wavered. "And I think I've spent my whole life learning the same lesson, just from a different direction. Maybe we're both too broken for this to actually work." "Don't say that." His voice had gone rough, urgent in a way that cracked slightly through his usual composure. "Don't decide this is impossible before we've even tried to fix it. How do we fix it, Rafael? Tell me exactly how we fix the fact that you tested the last woman you loved, and I have no way of knowing you wouldn't do the same to me eventually, when things got complicated enough." He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and painful, filled with everything neither of them knew how to say. Finally he exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so uncharacteristically defeated that it startled her. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I don't have a perfect answer for you. I only know that the thought of you walking away feels worse than anything my father ever taught me to fear." Valentina felt her resolve wavering dangerously, and she hated herself for it, hated how easily his honesty could still unravel her carefully constructed defenses. "That's not enough, Rafael. Wanting something isn't the same as knowing how to actually have it without destroying it." "Then teach me." The words came out raw, almost desperate. "Tell me what you need from me, and I'll do it. I'll do anything except let you disappear back into being just my housekeeper, like none of this ever happened." She wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than anything, to cross the small distance of the kitchen counter and let herself fall back into the warmth she'd felt on that terrace before the newspaper clipping, before the fear had crept back in and claimed every fragile inch of ground they'd gained. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while the wound was still this raw. "I need time," she said finally, backing toward the door. Real time, not just a few days of avoiding each other in the hallways. Take whatever you need. His voice followed her as she left, quiet and hollow, carrying a loneliness that mirrored her own far more than either of them was ready to admit. I'll be here. But as she climbed the stairs to her small room that night, curling beneath blankets that had never felt colder, Valentina wondered if being here was enough, or if some distances, once opened, simply refused to close again, no matter how much either of them wished otherwise. Somewhere below, she imagined him still standing in that kitchen, coffee gone cold, wrestling with a version of himself he didn't know how to become fast enough to save what they'd only just begun to build together. Valentina hadn't expected to find her mother's address on Rafael's desk calendar, scrawled in his own handwriting, beside a time and date 3 days from now. She stood frozen in the hallway outside his study, staring at the small notebook left open on the console table, wondering if she'd misread it, if exhaustion and heartbreak were finally playing tricks on her mind. She hadn't spoken to Rafael in 8 days. 8 days of careful avoidance, of mechanical routines, of nights spent staring at the ceiling of her small room, wondering if she'd made the right choice in pulling back. And now, apparently, he'd found her mother's address without asking her, which either meant something deeply invasive or something she wasn't quite ready to name. She found him an hour later on the terrace, the same terrace where everything had both begun and unraveled, standing at the railing with his jacket discarded somewhere and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, staring out at a sky bruising toward evening. "You went looking for my mother." He turned, and something in his expression, open, unguarded, entirely unlike the careful composure he usually wore, made her chest tighten before he'd even said a word. "I wanted to ask her permission before I did something that concerns both of you." "Permission for what?" "To ask you something I should have asked weeks ago, properly, without hiding behind money or status or any of the things that have made this so complicated." He crossed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back, the way he had on this same terrace before everything fell apart. "But first, I owe you something else." "What?" "An apology that actually means something instead of just words." His voice had lost every trace of its usual polish, stripped down to something raw and unguarded. "I spent 8 days thinking about everything you said, about Isabella, about trust, about whether I'm capable of being someone who doesn't test the people who matter, who doesn't retreat into calculation the moment things get difficult. And what did you decide? That you were right to be afraid. What I did to her was cruel, and I've spent years telling myself it was caution instead of admitting it was cowardice, dressed up as strategy." He held her gaze, unflinching despite how difficult the admission clearly was. "But I also decided that being afraid of becoming my father isn't the same as actually becoming him. I have a choice every single day about which version of myself I want to be. And I choose the version that trusts you completely, even though every instinct I inherited tells me that's dangerous." Valentina felt something crack open in her chest, cautious hope threading through months of careful self-protection. "That's a nice speech, Rafael, but speeches aren't the same as... I resigned from the board yesterday." The words landed like a physical blow, stopping whatever she'd been about to say. "You what?" "Not entirely. I've restructured my role, handed day-to-day operations to my COO, kept only the decisions that actually matter to me." He ran a hand through his hair, something almost nervous in the gesture, entirely unlike the controlled man she'd first met. "I've spent my whole life letting the company define who I was, letting my father's expectations dictate every choice. I want space to figure out who I am when I'm not performing an empire, and I want that space with you, if you'll let me." "Rafael, that's an enormous decision to make because of you, yes." He said it simply, without apology, closing the last distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the familiar cedarwood scent that had haunted her for weeks. "I'm not asking you to fix me, Valentina. I'm asking you to let me try to become someone worth trusting, in real time with you watching, with every mistake I'll inevitably make laid bare instead of hidden behind investigators and tests." Her eyes filled despite every effort to stay composed. "And my mother, what does she have to do with any of this?" "I wanted her blessing before I did this properly." He reached into his jacket pocket and Valentina's breath caught as he produced not a ring, not anything so dramatic, but a small, worn photograph, her mother, years younger, standing outside the small apartment where Valentina had grown up. She showed me this when I visited, told me stories about you as a child, about how stubborn you were, how you never let anyone define your worth by what they could give you, instead of who you actually were. You actually went to see her. I needed her to know my intentions were serious before I asked you this. He took her hand gently, and this time she didn't pull away, didn't let fear override the trembling hope building steadily in her chest. Valentina Reyes, I don't have a perfect track record. I've made mistakes that hurt people who deserved better. But I'm asking you to believe that loving you has already changed me more than 15 years of therapy, and every lesson my father tried to drill into me combined. That's not exactly a traditional declaration. I'm not exactly a traditional man. The ghost of a smile touched his mouth, fragile and hopeful. But I am, completely and without reservation, in love with you. And I'm asking for the chance to prove that every single day, for as long as you'll let me. The evening light caught the tears finally spilling down her cheeks, and Valentina found herself unable to summon a single one of the careful arguments she'd rehearsed over 8 sleepless nights. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance he'd left for her to choose, and let herself, for the first time since the newspaper clipping had shattered her careful trust, believe that some walls really were worth tearing down. Behind them, the city lights flickered on one by one as evening deepened, and neither of them moved to go inside, content instead to stand exactly where they were. 2 people who had spent their whole lives guarding against exactly this kind of vulnerability, finally choosing it anyway. The gala invitation arrived 3 weeks later, embossed and formal, marking the annual charity dinner the Montenegro family had hosted for over 2 decades. Valentina held the heavy cream cardstock in her hands, feeling the weight of what it meant, her first public appearance as Rafael's partner, not his housekeeper, standing beside him in front of exactly the kind of people who'd spent their whole lives learning to sort others by name and net worth. "You don't have to come if you're not ready," Rafael said, watching her turn the invitation over in her hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm ready." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm just aware of what it means. Once people see us together, there's no pretending anymore." "Good." He took her hand, threading their fingers together with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks. "I'm done pretending. I want the whole city to know exactly who I've chosen." The night of the gala, Valentina stood in front of the mirror in a dress Rafael had insisted on buying her, deep emerald silk that fit like it had been made for her, though she suspected it had been made for her, tailored quietly and precisely without her knowledge. She smoothed the fabric, catching her own reflection, hardly recognizing the woman staring back, though something steady in her own eyes told her she hadn't actually changed at all. Just found room, finally, to be seen. The ballroom glittered when they arrived, chandeliers throwing prisms of light across marble floors, the low murmur of old money and older gossip filling every corner. Valentina felt the shift the moment they walked in together, conversations pausing, heads turning, the particular quality of silence that came from several hundred people simultaneously recalculating their assumptions. "There she is." A woman's voice cut through the crowd, sharp and cold, and Valentina turned to find an elegant older woman approaching with the kind of practiced smile that promised nothing good. "Rafael's little project, the housekeeper turned society darling. Aunt Beatrice." Rafael's voice carried a warning Valentina hadn't heard from him before, protective and immediate. "This is Valentina, my partner." Partner. Beatrice's eyes swept over Valentina with obvious calculation, cataloguing the dress, the posture, the absence of family name worth mentioning. "How progressive of you, Rafael. Your father would be rolling in his grave." "My father spent his whole life teaching me that love was a liability." Rafael's grip on Valentina's hand tightened, steady and certain. "I've decided he was wrong about that, along with several other things. The board won't be pleased investors talk, Rafael. Reputation matters." "Then let them talk." His voice remained calm, but something unyielding had settled into it, a certainty Valentina had never heard from him before. I built this company's reputation on results. I'll build my personal life on something that actually matters to me. Beatrice's mouth thinned, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so cleanly. We'll see how long this lasts. We will. Rafael didn't flinch, didn't retreat into the careful diplomacy Valentina knew he was capable of. But it'll last exactly as long as I decide it will. And right now, that looks like the rest of my life. Beatrice retreated eventually, unsatisfied but unable to find further purchase, and Valentina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That could have gone worse. That's my aunt, on her best behavior. Rafael's mouth curved into something almost amused. Give her time, she'll come around or she won't. Either way, it changes nothing about what I want. They moved through the rest of the evening together, weathering curious glances and careful questions, occasional cutting remarks disguised as pleasantries. But for every Beatrice, there was someone else, old business partners who remembered Rafael's father fondly and seemed genuinely pleased to see him laughing, actually laughing for the first time in years. Employees from the company who'd heard whispers of the housekeeper, who'd somehow softened the coldest man in the industry, watching with quiet, hopeful curiosity rather than judgment. Later, near midnight, they stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the party's noise muffled behind glass doors, the night air cool against Valentina's bare shoulders. Rafael wrapped his jacket around her without being asked, the gesture so simple and thoughtful, it made her chest ache with something warm and overwhelming. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, watching her face in the moonlight. None. She meant it completely, felt it settle into her bones with a certainty that surprised her. I spent my whole life believing people like us don't get stories like this. Turns out I was wrong. We're not finished writing it yet. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers, the city spread out beneath them like it had been that very first stormy night, though everything between them had changed entirely since then. I want a lifetime of proving you made the right choice tonight. Months later, the Montenegro mansion no longer echoed with cold, careful silence. Laughter filled the halls now. Carmen's warm chuckle drifting from the kitchen, Valentina's mother visiting for Sunday dinners that stretched late into the evening, Rafael learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to let people matter without waiting for the moment they'd inevitably leave. The house that had once felt like a monument to isolation had become, against every prediction anyone had made, a home built on the unlikely, unguarded love between a man who'd learned distrust as a birthright and a woman who'd refused to let his walls define what either of them deserved. Sometimes in quiet moments, Valentina still caught herself waiting for the ground to shift beneath her, for the fairy tale logic of it all to collapse under the weight of everything that had once seemed impossible about their story. But then Rafael would find her in whatever corner of the house she'd wandered into, would wrap his arms around her without a word, and the fear would dissolve into something steadier. The quiet, certain knowledge that some love stories didn't need a perfect beginning to earn a lasting ending. Only two people brave enough to keep choosing each other, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. Some hearts don't fall in love. They unlearn fear, one trembling choice at a time. Valentina taught Rafael that trust isn't weakness, it's the bravest risk a wounded heart can take. And you? What walls have you built, waiting for someone patient enough to knock them down? Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing where you all come from. And if you want stories like this every single day with no ads and no interruptions, the link to my app is in the first pinned comment. In there you'll find even deeper, more intense romances, some a little bolder too. Go check it out now. Have you ever imagined having access to amazing stories every day of the week, exactly the way you've always wanted? With no ads interrupting the best parts, no cuts, and no censorship? On Allure TV, that's exactly what you'll find. Choose from a wide variety of genres based on your mood: passionate romances, billionaire stories, mafia romances, second-chance love stories, forbidden love, and much more. Every day, new content is waiting for you. And the best part? You can listen in the language you prefer or read whenever you want. Create your own playlist and binge the stories you love most, in any order, anytime you like. No ads, no interruptions. Just you and the story. The link is pinned in the comments, or simply point your camera at the QR code on the screen. Access it now.